Hello ladies and gentlemen, it's the Historical Gamer once again, and today I'm going to be taking a look at Scourge of War Waterloo. The game just came out today, and as you can guess it from the title, it looks at the Battle of Waterloo, taking us across the pond and looking at Napoleonic warfare. Now, the game is the newest product by the Norbsoft Dev team, and just in interest of full disclosure, I was actually on the team. Am on the team, a member of the testing team. I've done a little bit of work on the website, the Facebook, and things like that. But just sort of putting that out there. This isn't really a first impressions video because I don't think that would be genuine and honest, given the fact that I'm really involved in this game and really love the game. So I don't want to give any kind of false sense of objectivity there, but I did want to show the game off now that it's come out. In the game, it has several different game modes. It has battles in which you play individual scenarios as part of the Battle of Waterloo, has a Sandbox Campaign, which is a brand new campaign. You pick kind of random, or you pick units in amongst the order of battles that fought in the Battle of Waterloo, and then fight it out over an actual kind of campaign map. And then there's a sandbox game which just allows you to pick different units and fight them out on one of the pre-built maps without the whole maneuvering and marching across map. The game also has, as I mentioned, the individual scenarios, which looks at 20 different scenarios in the Battle of Waterloo. You can play as the Prussians, as the British, or I guess more accurately, the Anglo-Allied army under Wellington, the Prussians, or the French. The French have 10 scenarios of their own. The Anglo-Allies have 10 of their own. The battles range in size from brigade level, where you command a single brigade, to division and corps, and there's even 2 army scenarios where you can play the entire battle as either the commander of the Anglo-Allied / Prussian forces under Wellington or the French forces under Napoleon. Every single battle, when you select it, gives you a brief synopsis, tells you the length, your command, the time of day, the difficulty, the situation, gives you a little bit of a command map here. You can see where the battle is going to be taking place, in this case near the Hogemont, which is a farmhouse which turned into a fortress during the Battle of Waterloo. It also gives you a summary of the forces involved, the scores that you need for victory, and some biographical information of your character. Scourge of War is a lot like an RPG and a lot like a real-time tactical simulation game, kind of in the vein of like a Napoleon Total War, but just in the battle side of things. The game puts you in control of one individual character in a given battle. So in this case, we're General Baudouin, and I'm sure I'm butchering the pronunciations. You're going to have to live with that. I do have certain limitations. Pronouncing names is one of them, or pronouncing anything that isn't easy to pronounce from an English tongue, so I apologize for that. But it puts you in control of one individual character. In this case, we're in control of the Brigadier Commander Baudouin, who's actually killed at the Battle of Waterloo, commanding the brigade on the French left, the Allied right. It was the first French unit to attack the Allied forces. It kind of opened the Battle of Waterloo as it attacked into a woods that was in front of the Hogemont, and ended up facing several units of the Coldstream Guards and rifled units, and ended up fighting a vicious skirmish action as it attempted to eject the Anglo forces from the woods in front of the fortress complex. You can see here, there's the woods. We're deploying some skirmishers out front. In the Scourge of War Waterloo, unlike previous Scourge of War games, you can actually choose to divide your regiments up into smaller units and create skirmishers, and then attach them back into the regiments. So in many ways it acts a lot like skirmishers did in the Napoleonic era. You can see, even though we're only commanding a force of about 2,700 men, there's a lot more men than that represented on the field here. We can kind of scroll through and see all these different troops. They just happen to be under the command of an AI, or artificial intelligence, not under our direct command. So Scourge of War is really unique in that it gives you this sense of being just an individual cog amongst a giant war machine. If you want to command everything that you see here, you can. As I mentioned, there are those scenarios that look at the army. But in this case, we're just commanding an individual French brigade. We can hear some artillery off to our left firing at the enemy. We can also hear some artillery off to the right as well firing off to the enemy. So just a massive game, sprawling landscapes, a 5x5 mile map, a 6-to-1 sprite ratio, which means there are tens of thousands of individual men represented on the battlefield. Again, it's really in many ways unparalleled in terms of the scale and scope, and I would argue the quality that the AI puts out against you. But again, as I've said, I am biased in that manner, so keep that in mind as you watch this. I'm going to move these skirmishers forward into the woods here to engage what we've been told are some enemy troops in front of us. So we're going to go ahead and see what happens here as we advance. Now, things can get a little bit crowded here. You can see these woods get a little bit congested and difficult to see. And we can kind of scroll down here to the ground level, and we can see our troops skirmishing it out here with some rifled Anglo forces. That's represented by the green jackets, I believe, of riflemen. And then you've also got some just standard British redcoats, members of the French or the British Foot Guard as well. So these are some real elite British units, some Nassauers, and again some of the British Foot Guard here against us as the Battle of Waterloo begins or commences. Now, as I mentioned, the game does have quite a bit of foliage here, especially in this scenario on the left. Out toward the middle of the battlefield, there's a lot more of an open feel as units can march through largely flat terrain. But if you just tap on the T key, it'll actually get rid of some of the trees if you want to have a better vantage point. Those artillery are not under our command. Again, they're the AI fighting it out. This scenario, really, it's just the one brigade that's engaged, but in other scenarios, you might command a division or a brigade, and again, have many other units that you're kind of fighting alongside. So while the game gives you that ability to have total control if you want, much in the way that most other real-time tactical games do, it also has that ability, again, to feel like you're just an individual commander. In fact, if you are Badoon and then you go ahead and you charge forward and you get yourself killed, you lose the scenario, because that's who you are on the map. That's one of those things that makes this game very unique, is that if your character dies, you lose the scenario, regardless of what the rest of your brigade is doing. So you do want to take care of yourself. You want to be aware of where you are if you do get too far ahead and enemy troops are firing and you're kind of walking into the line of fire. You definitely do risk getting struck by fire and being killed. Now, you can click on the flag, you can right-click on the flag, and you can get a whole bunch of different unit options. In this case, what I'm actually doing is I'm unsplitting these units, so they'll go back and they'll rejoin their parent battalion there, and then strengthen that force. As I move my troops forward, I've found the enemy, I know where they are. I don't think the value of skirmishers is going to be too useful at this point. I'm going to just go ahead and slowly incorporate these guys back into the battalion to strengthen it back into its full strength. Each one of these is a unit, or started as a unit of about 100 men. Once I'm in place, I'll go ahead and launch a full brigade-size assault straight through the woods. Actually, it's up a small hill as we get rid of these trees here. Again, you can see by pressing the T key, it gets rid of those trees. You can have multiple levels where you see some trees or no trees or what have you. It also does terrain, so it does things like crops, and there you go. But we'll kind of leave it on a medium setting here where we can see that we're obviously in a wood, but it's a little bit more easy to command. Now, there are players who play the Scourge of War games who would rather see everything, and in fact, there's a setting in the game that lets you kind of glue yourself to your saddle so you would only see what your character would see from the back of his horse, which can make commanding much more difficult. I don't play that way too often, but as we move up here, you can see we're starting to engage the enemy with some of our full-sized battalions, and as we do that, we'll just go ahead and right-click on our flag, and we'll see we've got that option to unsplit, and they'll go ahead and rejoin their parent battalion there. Again, you can split them back off if you want, but we're engaged here now with the enemy. And what we can do is we can also click on these 3 rifles, that icon here on the bottom of the screen. What that represents is it represents a Volley Fire command. So essentially, when you click that button, your troops will hold fire. I'll go ahead and click it here. When you click that button, your troops will hold fire. Instead of firing at will, where everyone shoots when they're loaded up, they'll actually wait until everybody is loaded up, and they'll just kind of wait there. And then you can have a volley go off where everyone fires their musket at once. Obviously, you'll inflict more casualties in that instant, and you can also deal a little bit of a additional morale hit to the enemy if they take a huge chunk of casualties in a sudden jolt. Whereas, you know, individual fire is a more constant stream of casualties, but less of a oomph, or less of an impact, if you will. Volley fire was common in the Napoleonic era. Often you would march forward, you'd all fire off your initial rounds, and then you'd fire off your initial rounds again, you'd load up and fire a volley. And then as the engagement became more chaotic and the smoke built up, commanders would lose control of that volley mechanic. You wouldn't have soldiers firing off in neat, pretty volleys the entire engagement. It would kind of break down into a fire-at-will situation. But at least battles would start often, or engagements between battalions would start often with a couple of volleys before things would break down into a more general engagement in kind of the more, if you're familiar with the American Civil War, the Civil War style, where units didn't really march up and fire off all at once. Rather, what they did was they kind of just fired at will. You might all fire off at once, and then you just kind of reload at your own pace. We'll go ahead and let that volley go, and you can see there that fired off an entire volley and hit several enemy troops, something like 9 or 10, all went down at once, and again we're engaged with another battalion off to the left. We'll go ahead and get rid of this unit here. There's several other commands. I'm not going to go into too much depth of the different commands available, because this is just going to be the first of many videos that I am going to make looking at Scourge of War Waterloo. So in this scenario, obviously we're looking at a brigade level scenario, but we will branch out and look at division level, corps level, and perhaps even an army level scenario as well. So that is something that I'm looking forward to helping show off. Now I'm going to go ahead and order these battalions around. I'm going to try and get one battalion around the enemy flank. Again, if you can fire a large line of troops into the enemy along their side where they can't really respond, it'll make you much more effective and help drive them from the field. Getting hit from the rear and the side without being able to respond would obviously not be a very pleasant experience here. You can see the smoke is well done, although it doesn't quite hang like real smoke would, but again, we had enough difficulty seeing with all the trees in place. Imagine if the smoke was in place as well. I'm sure that'll be modded into the game, just not practical at this point in time. Alright, so I've chosen to move the men in a maneuver column formation. The French were very famous for kind of these massed formations with kind of a narrow front and a deep rank. Not quite a column with just a couple of men in place, but rather almost like a chunk of a line followed by multiple lines in behind that. That was a useful maneuver and assault formation that the French would use throughout the Napoleonics, and that is a formation that is available as well in the game. It also makes changing formation in combat much easier, because you still have a line that can respond to the enemy with fire if they have to, just not very efficiently, and then you can just kind of spread out with the other units moving along your wing and presenting some kind of face, whereas when you are kind of maneuvering in column, which generally is just 4 or so wide and, you know, hundreds long, you're a narrow kind of defenseless column. Whereas a column, or as a maneuver or an assault column, has much more offensive firepower, in addition to just, I'd say, more utility on a battlefield. One other thing the game lets you do is take control. That's what I just clicked, that little flag icon. Allows you basically to turn the AI for that unit off and just have the player take total control if you want to micromanage things. Now in a scenario like this, where you're commanding just a battalion, or sorry, just a brigade, it's very easy to micromanage battalions. You can imagine in the heart of an assault of a corps with 18,000 men and dozens of battalions, that would become very chaotic and difficult. So the AI does a pretty good job of maneuvering, actually does a damn good job of kind of handling itself and keeping itself safe, especially when it comes to square formations. We're not going to see that in this battle because there's not going to be any, at least I hope, there's not going to be any British cavalry attacking us, and we don't have any cavalry under our command. But what a square formation is another new feature in the Scourge of War games, where basically you form up in a square, literally, with your troops having their bayonets pointing out. The front rank just kind of has their bayonets on the ground pointed up in kind of a almost like a pikeman-like formation. The rear ranks have their bayonets pointed out as well. They can also fire at the enemy horsemen, and you kind of close ranks into a square so that you have essentially a pointed edge pointing out all around the square. That makes horsemen very reluctant to charge in. Horses don't like charging onto pointy objects, so it's a real effective defense against cavalry, and was a vital infantry formation in the Napoleonic age, and the Battle of Waterloo demonstrates how effective it actually was against cavalry. Essentially, if you formed into a square formation before the enemy cavalry arrived, it was highly highly unlikely that the enemy horse would be able to break you. It happened rarely. There was an occasion in Spain where 2 French squares were broken, but supposedly one of the, the reason in the same battle, which was just astronomical and rare, one of the reasons it happened, supposedly, rumor has it that there was as the French were charging forward, before the horses kind of sheared off and pulled away out of fear of the points or what have you, and not wanting to impale themselves, one of the horse was shot and collapsed and basically skidded into the column, kind of throwing the column into disorder as the horse essentially fell into the men, and then that created a gap in the square which allowed the British cavalry into the French square, and they cut the square to pieces from the inside. As you can imagine, men on horseback with your back faced to them, a very chaotic situation. And then as the French infantry scattered in panic, they attempt to break into another French infantry square. They disorganize it, it loses its cohesion, and then the cavalry follows them in and destroys that square as well. So it rarely happened. There was an incident, I believe, at the Battle of Quatre Bras, which was just a couple of days before the Battle of Waterloo, in which the British had formed square, and the lovely Prince of Orange ordered a unit to unform square in the face of cavalry, and they were cut to pieces. Infantry formed up in a line against cavalry, absolutely vulnerable. Their flanks, their long line, cavalry could simply ride around you, hit you in the rear. There was really no way to prevent the horsemen from tearing you apart and just butchering you, as the British actually would do to the French assault, d'Aileron's assault at the Battle of Waterloo, when the troops were unable to form square in time. The key for cavalry to defeating infantry was making sure that they hit the infantry before they could form an organized square. The key for infantry against cavalry was forming that square before the cavalry could come up. And as you can imagine, a square formation is incredibly vulnerable to concentrated fire of a line because of its limited firepower. You don't have your whole line facing out and shooting. You can just respond to the enemy with a small amount of your troops, whereas the artillery also has a big giant target. They can shoot a solid shot through the front rank, and it can rip right through to the rear ranks. So very vulnerable to cavalry, or very vulnerable to infantry and artillery, but very resistant to cavalry. Anyway, enough talking about squares here. It's been about 5 minutes talking about a formation that we're not even going to see in this battle here. As you can see, the artillery continues to fire on the enemy. We've driven them back. We've taken the wood, and we've also driven the units to the left of this fortified complex here, the Hogamon, and again, I'm sure I'm butchering the pronunciation here. We've driven them back, and we've taken possession of our objective here. Now, we just got a courier that's telling us that there is a secondary objective, which is this large courthouse, this large farm complex directly ahead. You can see there's now an objective tally above that. That is the Hogamon. It is incredibly difficult to take. It is a fortified building. It has some troops on some ramparts. You can see the enemies deployed some skirmishers out front of the wall, but they also have some troops behind the wall that are on some elevated ramparts that can fire out. And then the flag on top of the building, what that basically means is that the enemy actually has troops inside the buildings as well. And because of the way the building's designed, you don't have the ability to assault directly into it. So essentially you need to convince the enemy to withdraw from the building before you can enter it yourself. That's something that was necessary because of the fact that, well, frankly, at the Battle of Waterloo, the French really didn't directly assault into the buildings. There was a famous incident where a French, I believe it was a sergeant with an axe kind of wielding, broke into the courtyard and threatened the Hogamon itself. That was the only time. Well, there may have been a second incident, but they were both very limited, with only 50 or 60 men making it through the fortress with a direct assault. It was not feasible for hundreds of men to charge through. It was simply too hard. It was a straight wooden wall around the outside and then buildings without any real way to break in, and the French didn't bring ladders, so there's no real feasible way to charge in, as was the case in the actual battle, with a few minor exceptions. But again, it wouldn't be very accurate or historical to allow the game to have thousands of men charge in. So when you see these little pentagon yellow shaped figures here on the left above the building, and you know it's an enemy fort, you've got to reduce the enemy and essentially compel them to withdraw prior to actually occupying the fort themselves. There are several well-known forts which are on the battlefield. The most well-known is the one we're assaulting now. As you can see here as we zoom down and look at the battlefield, from the ground level. One other thing is you can damage forts with artillery fire, so as forts become more damaged and the troops in them take more casualties, they're more likely to withdraw, and you could theoretically bring a large battery of artillery, if you commanded it, down to pound the fort. You can see actually now there's some smoke rising from the fort there, which indicates that it is starting to take some damage, likely from some of that artillery that was positioned on the flank here. Meanwhile, we're fighting it out with some enemy infantry, which did decide to position themselves in front of the wall for one reason or another. And we've also got some troops here on the left. They're not shooting at those troops in the open. They're shooting at the troops inside the buildings. So again, they're not going to inflict much in the way of the casualties. But fortunately for us at this point in time, there are very few Allied units inside the Hougoumont fortress. It would appear just to be maybe one or two enemy regiments that are in there based on the number of flags. There's only 2 flags in there. So at the moment, there are very weak enemy forces, so while we may not be able to inflict tons and tons of casualties on them because of their very high defensive rating, the enemy also is not going to inflict too many casualties on us at this point. So that's an advantage for us that we really should press home to try and get ourselves essentially around the fort complex and maybe destroy it or drive them out before any reinforcements to come. Unlikely we'd be able to do that with a lone brigade, however. We simply don't have the manpower, but that probably would have been the best way for the French to take the Hougoumont in the actual Battle of Waterloo, would have been to surround it and just sort of wear it down, much as La Haye-Sainte ended up falling to the French largely because the British defenders ran out of ammo as opposed to being overrun. Much would have been the same with this fortress complex. As it was, however, General Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte's brother, Jerome, who commanded the division which launched that first assault on the left, did not pursue this strategy. Rather, they were launching kind of frontal, ill-coordinated attacks that had turned into a meat grinder as the French were steadily bled down and drawing more and more forces into what was supposed to be a diversionary attack on the French left and the Anglo-Allied right. It ended up becoming an attack that consumed 2 of Napoleon's best divisions of infantry, which would have been more aptly utilized in later assaults or to help hold the Prussians off later in the war, or not war, later in the battle. As it was, these divisions were chewed up in what was supposed to be a diversionary attack and ended up turning into a very major affair in which the French would suffer and never actually take the fortress complex itself. Now you can see here we drove off some of those enemy troops that were to our front. They've pulled back into the fort, and the enemy, again, is still fairly weak in the fort. They just don't have all that many men. You can see those artillery shots are kind of exploding. Those would be shell shots. There were a couple of different types of artillery during the Napoleonic Wars. Types of artillery fire. Shells would be basically an empty cannonball that would have gunpowder in it. That's what you're seeing there, that kind of puff of smoke as it explodes in midair. Very similar to what you would see later in the Civil War, where a fuse would be cut, and if it was cut well, it would explode over top of the enemy, dropping shrapnel into them. If it was cut poorly, it would sail past and, explode either too early in midair or maybe land and explode in the ground. The Battle of Waterloo was also unique in that because the ground was wet, many fuses on shells that were poorly cut would be put out and extinguished by the ground itself as the shell landed. Now, I've gone ahead and I've accelerated the time here. This is only a 30-minute long scenario. We basically won the scenario by taking the woods. It's a very easy scenario. It's a green scenario. It's designed for a new player. But you can see that the British have dispatched some reinforcements to the fort here, and there are massive, as I kind of speed things up, the smoke kind of accumulates. And as the British have decided to go ahead and send reinforcements to the fort, it appears we did drive one of the enemy regiments out, but just as the new British reinforcements have arrived. So while we did accomplish something with driving out that very small enemy regiment which was in the fort, we're not going to be able to take it now, certainly not with as little time as we have left. The British battalion that was deployed, also much larger, over 1,000 men, so you can just tell the volume of fire that's coming from the fort much more substantial. You can see all that smoke coming from those buildings that are now occupied by British soldiers being put out and inflicting grievous casualties now, especially on this battalion of ours here on the top of the map. You can see their starting to lose some pretty heavy casualties, and their fatigue is increasing. Again, their manpower is draining rapidly. Also, keep in mind the time is flying by as well. You can see the clock on the lower left there is accelerating quite rapidly. Meanwhile, our troops down here in the south just continuing to fight it out with those British troops behind the fortress walls. And again, doesn't look like we're going to take the fort, but nonetheless, taking the woods is going to give us enough victory points to win a victory. You can see here the British have driven back this battalion on our left just through sheer casualties and firepower with those new units. But anyway, folks, I hope you enjoyed this kind of a sneak peek. I guess not really a sneak peek, the game is out, but very early look at Scourge of War Waterloo, the newest game out by Norbsoft Dev. You can see there we won a major victory over the Anglo forces. Although we did fail to take the Hougoumont, we did take the woods, which sets up the following attack. So as our troops retreat there, you can go back into the battlefield if you want. But that's about all we're going to take a look at here today. I hope you did enjoy this video, and look for more. The next scenario I'm going to do is going to be a division size engagement, then I'll do a corps, and then I'll even do an army. Some of those larger scenarios might have to be broken up into multiple videos, but we'll see how that all shakes out. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed the video. Let me know what your thoughts are, and until next time, this is the Historical Gamer saying thank you for watching, and I'm out.